Hello everyone, and welcome to Autocrat, and we are delighted this week to be joined by Jerry Landry from Presidencies of the United States. Hello, Jerry.
Hello, Vince, Cassie. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here. So, the topic today is, as might be expected from the title of Jerry's podcast, a bit more United States focused than we usually are. We will be discussing the influence that Rome and Roman civilization have had on the US and US history.
Absolutely. And I think, in planning this episode, I think we've both found even deeper connections than I think we were initially thinking when we first started talking. So
the words just spilled onto the page.
Well, and it's funny, this is actually a continuation of a panel discussion that I was on during the Intelligent Speech Conference recently, and it was all about these ideas of pen names and pseudonyms, and that was one of the first thoughts that came to my mind because there are so many Roman pseudonyms that were used in political discourse in the Revolution and early Republic period, and it's amazing to see kind of how these folks who were trying to conceive of a new republic turn to this idea of the Roman Republic and examples from there to help to guide their discourse.
Absolutely. I think you've got the example of one or perhaps several individuals labeling themselves as Brutus, which I can only assume is after the assassin of Julius Caesar.
Well, and it was interesting with that one because that one was actually an anti-federalist take on things. Of course, we have Publius, which was the pseudonym that Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay used for what became known as the Federalist Papers. But the fact that you have this Brutus who is anti-federalist, and it also speaks to one of these things, with some of these we know who it is because they will either send like a copy of it to somebody, and so we'll know, okay, well, that's so-and-so. Or they'll admit later, okay, well, this was us. But then there are certain cases, and this one, they have like 3 folks who it may have been. And there's also questions because there are 2 people named Brutus in Roman history. Of course, the most famous Brutus, but it was, the Brutus, the family was so prominent and prominent for a while. There are questions as to which of the 2 Bruti were they actually trying to channel for this?
Yes, so it could be the Brutus who killed Caesar or the one who went against the Roman kings about 500 years earlier.
Exactly. And with either one, you do get the sense, because that was one of the concerns about the Constitution, that it was investing too much power, and especially in the presidency, and this idea that the president could become a king. And so you see with that, and typically that was the case, if they picked a name from antiquity to use as a pseudonym, it usually spoke to what their point was in actually writing the essay or the series of essays to begin with.
Yeah. So, for the benefit of our listeners who perhaps may or may not be as familiar with early American political discourse, I believe the Federalists are more in favour of centralising US power in this time, whereas I believe the Democratic Republicans are more in favour of devolved government, the government not really getting involved and just spreading out power.
Exactly. And so this term Federalist began during the debate over the Constitution. And so that's why we talk about, Federalist versus anti-Federalist, but it's really within that context of the Constitution and trying to get to ratification of the Constitution. The Federalists were for it because they wanted to create the Federal Republic. Anti-Federalists were against it. They felt that it was too much centralization of power, and many of them still preferred the old Articles of Confederation, which was a loose confederation of the various states. But then once you get to the early Republic period, you do continue this idea of the Federalists becoming a political, the term party is used, but it was really more of a loose idea of what a party was than what we think of political parties nowadays. But yes, the Democratic Republicans, they were more the supporters of Jefferson and James Madison, and they were for a more strict conception of the Constitution. The Federalists felt that there should be more power at the federal level.
Right. Well, I guess it makes sense to use Brutus then if you're anti-federalist.
Exactly. And that's the thing, that was such the concern, and especially this idea, and of course, we still have these debates throughout American history, how much power should one person in the president have. But this idea that the president could potentially become a king, they weren't as worried about George Washington. And when they were crafting the Constitution, of course, they thought of Washington. And this gets to this idea, the ideal of Cincinnatus, which we can talk more about in a bit. But it was seen that here was Washington, who had already handed over great power, and so he can be trusted with great power. But what happens after him? And especially what happens with somebody like John Adams, who has sons who can succeed him? Does this become a monarchy?
Yes, and I believe John Adams was criticised in the early days for having a more monarchist leaning, according to some, right?
Absolutely. He was very much, and he did do some writings right after he became vice president, right after the government under the Constitution was really kicking off, and he was expressing more favorable views towards the British government, which of course folks were like, oh no, we don't want the British government. They have a monarch. We just got rid of that. Come on.
I've heard someone describe it as not wanting to swap out George III for George I.
Exactly. And you do see these folks, and especially like there's this entire debate at the beginning of Washington's presidency about just what to call the president, because it was seen that you needed titles in order to be respected. But it finally ended up, this is a republic. We don't want that. We're going to turn back to this, ideal of the Roman Republic. We want to keep it simple. So just call the president Mr. President. We don't need the lofty titles of a king or an emperor.
Yeah. And the early Americans, I believe, did imitate the Roman reluctance to take office quite well. So isn't that the case?
Oh, yes. And it was really this idea, you did not want to be seen as being too ambitious for power. Because again, going back to this idea of the republic, you don't want to be seen as working to become a king or a Caesar. You want to be seen as somebody, this idea of Cincinnatus, somebody who can be granted great power reluctantly, and then once things are done, once the crisis or the intent is over, then they hand back over the power and they retire to private life as a private citizen.
Yes. Well, I suppose that leads quite nicely into the American Cincinnatus, as I should call him, or George Washington himself, which strikes me as a very obvious parallel with the Republic in the sense of, like you say, serving the country and then taking his distance after it no longer needed him and could stand on its own 2 feet.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It was such an inspiration to people that here you've got George Washington, who kept the Continental Army together, fought off rivals for power. And then once the war was over, he said, I'm done. I'm handing in my command. I'm going back home. And so when they started crafting this new government, and that's the thing, like George Washington was there at the Constitutional Convention. He was presiding over it as its president. And so as they were crafting the idea of the presidency in the Constitution, They just had to look up at George Washington, and we want something that will have power and prestige, and that we know the power will be handed back over. But it's interesting because that was one of the things, and, it took, nearly 200 years before term limits for presidents became a thing. Before that, there was no set, okay, well, you can only run for 2 terms. And so Washington, folks were telling him in 1796, no, we really do need you. Everybody still agrees that you're the guy. And Washington was just like, I've done this for 8 years now. I'm done. I want to go home. Please leave me alone.
It is amazing how long it took before term limits were brought in. So were there any presidents before Franklin Roosevelt who did try and go for a 3rd term, or, well, I suppose only a 3rd term, because there had been none who'd served 3 and could go for a 4th?
Exactly. So there were actually a couple of examples of this. First of all, Ulysses S. Grant, he served for 2 terms and ended up retiring. But then he came back in 1880, and his supporters were trying to get him to run for a 3rd term. He was actually one of the main contenders in the Republican National Convention that year. But he wasn't able to get enough support, and the main rivals were canceling each other out. And so they ended up with what we now know of as a dark horse candidate. James A. Garfield became the nominee and then the president. But Grant did stand for a 3rd term. And likewise, Grover Cleveland, who, of course, there's been lots of talk about recently, he was at one point the only person who served for 2 non-consecutive terms. But if he would have actually won in 1888, would he have run for a 3rd term? We don't really know. We don't have a way of knowing. But he did stand for election at least for 3 terms. But then, of course, there's also Theodore Roosevelt, who sought the Republican nomination. He had taken over William McGinley's term when he was assassinated. He ran for his own full term, but then he said, no, I'm not going to run again. I consider those to be my 2 terms. And fast forward 4 years, and he realized that was a foolish idea. He really liked being president, and so he wanted to be president again. He ran for the Republican nomination against the incumbent, his former friend, William Howard Taft. Didn't get that, and so he decided, I'll just found my own party, and I'll run as a 3rd party candidate. He ended up not winning. He got more votes than Taft, which I'm sure he was happy about, but he actually wanted the presidency again, and he kept on being talked about, but then he ended up passing away before he could actually mount a full run again.
Wow. From what I understand of that election, wasn't it not so much him wanting to be president as not wanting Taft to be president? Or at least not anymore.
It was a little from column A and a little from column B. Like, when he made that pledge to not run again, and it was the night of his election to the full term, he said then, he told reporters, I'm not going to run for another term. And everybody around him just kind of paused. They were like, did he just say that? And then when they got him to the side, did you just say that? Why did you say that? You love being president. And he did. He enjoyed being president more than many of them, to be honest. But he decided, oh no, I'm gonna hand it off. But then he realized that he didn't have the power and authority that he did, and he still had things that he wanted to achieve. And so here we go again.
So then we fast forward to Franklin Roosevelt, who does get a 3rd term during the Second World War and is, I believe, elected to a 4th, but dies in office. Were there a lot of discussions in the same way that there must have been when Caesar was becoming increasingly powerful of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, let's say, making himself a king.
Absolutely. And that was one of the big debates, within the Democratic Party. They had many people who were reluctant to support nominating him for a third term, but they also realized, who else are we going to choose? And, oh, by the way, has anybody heard the news from Europe? Things aren't looking good. Maybe we do need this strong leadership. And that's kind of the tack that he took, that we just need this strong leadership. But of course, in his public face, he had to, I don't really want a third term. And it's interesting, like going into the Democratic National Convention that year, he's telling different folks different things. Like he's telling some of his key supporters who want to make a go of it on their own, oh yeah, I'm not really wanting to be president again. If you get the nomination, I will of course support you. And then he goes to somebody else and says the same thing. But meanwhile, folks are working behind the scenes because they know he really does want it. But it has to be in that old Roman fashion of, we know that you're reluctant, but we're calling on you to service. We want you to serve with what we're giving you. And of course, when that happens, when he wins the nomination and then wins the presidency, of course, he's serving again. And then the fourth term, there wasn't as much of that reluctance because, in for a penny, in for a pound. So it's like, we've already done this and we're in the middle of the war. Let's go ahead and let him wrap up World War II. But as soon as he's out of power, and of course he doesn't survive the fourth term, he dies in office, Republicans push for, no, we need term limits. We need an actual amendment that says the president can only serve 2 terms. And so that's how that came about. They actually had a provision in there for the sitting president, who was Harry Truman. Truman could have run again in 1952. But by that point, Truman was like, I'm done with this office. Pretty much like Washington, I'm ready to go home. Just let me go.
We should maybe rename that Washington Syndrome.
Exactly. No, I really do want to retire. Thank you.
Well, one thing you can say about Washington is, and indeed about many of these other presidents, is that they are very well represented in American statuary as well, which I think is another big influence from the classical age. For example, the Washington Monument, or the very famous statue of Lincoln sitting in the chair glowering out over the world.
Oh, yes. And you have so many examples of, American leaders who are dressed in like Roman togas. And it's interesting because it is that physical, artistic connection that they're trying to establish, that these are people who are public servants. They're not kings. They're public servants, just like the Roman Republic.
Yeah, it's impressive how many parallels there are like this once you start digging.
Absolutely. We see it reflected in art. We see it reflected in architecture. You see, this neoclassical revival in American buildings. And we've got examples, the U.S. Capitol, the Jefferson Memorial, the Rotunda at the University of Virginia. And it's intentional. They want to establish that connection between the Republic and the American Republic, between the Roman Republic and the American Republic. And in some ways, it's almost trying to evoke a physical reminder. We are a republic. We're not an empire. We're not a kingdom. We're a republic, just like Rome.
Although in saying that, I suppose there are some traditions that would almost fall more into the Roman imperial way of working, such as, for example, some city or state names. So, as a Roman example, the city of Orléans in France, and therefore New Orleans in America, are named after the Emperor Aurelian. And similarly, Washington is quite lucky, actually. He gets both a state and a city named after him.
Exactly. You see all these examples of places that, and again, intentional naming, but you start to really trace it back and you start to see some of these, of course, there are so many places that are named Carthage in the U.S. There are so many places named Rome in the U.S. And again, that's intentional. This idea that we're establishing this link with antiquity, with this past that we're revering, but then, where does the Republic stop and the Empire start? And do we actually see that? Sometimes we do have those imperial examples that creep up even in this intentional link to antiquity.
Weren't there more states even that were meant to be named after founding fathers than just Washington? I seem to remember there were a few abandoned ideas for some of those states.
Oh, yes. So there was supposed to be a state of Franklin, which was it's what's now kind of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. It was supposed to be kind of its own state. Ended up that didn't happen. There were proposals to split up some of the places. Like they had this grandiose idea of what was the Northwest Territory, which is basically, if you look at the U.S. now, kind of the Midwest region. They wanted it to be all of these smaller states. And so, of course, they went searching for names of, who can we name it after? Franklin, Jefferson, whoever. Let's just find some names. Let's throw in some Roman names as well. Who cares? We've got to name all these places. It ended up not working out that way, but it also speaks to this idea of trying to draw on the mythos of the American Republic and the Roman Republic in order to have those geographic ties to this idea of the Republic.
Yeah. Well, a grandiose, lofty aim.
Exactly. But yeah, Washington was able to get a state and the city named after him. And of course, there are so many Washington counties, so many Washington towns. There's a Washington parish in Louisiana. So he is all over the map because we want that link to the American Cincinnatus.
It is incredible. You actually preempted me on one of these points because I did a quick search for how many places called Rome there actually were in the United States, and I came back with 18, but I'm very impressed that you managed to preempt me there.
I know off the top of my head Rome, Georgia, but I know that there are so many more across the map,
Yeah.
Something I think would have been pretty funny is if each time there's been a new president, they renamed the state after that president. So now we would have, 45 states named after presidents.
Exactly. And there are so many presidents who do get to that pantheon of being able to have a place named after them. Lincoln's another big one. If you look across the map, you see so many towns and counties named after Lincoln. You've got Lincoln, Nebraska, and you even have, Liberia, the capital city is Monrovia, named after the fifth president, James Monroe. And that was because of this idea, the American Colonization Society, which Monroe supported. And so as they were founding Liberia, they wanted that connection because they were establishing a new republic on the continent of Africa. And so this link to the American Republic, which tries to link everything to the Roman Republic. So it's interesting how these place names really keep those ties going.
Yeah. Wasn't that idea suggested again during the US Civil War?
Of the colonization? Yes. Yeah, there were so many, and it's one of those things that it's an odd part of American history, to say the least. This idea that, and that's another thing that I think we can talk about and kind of compare and contrast, because we have this idea of slavery in Rome as well as America, but there are definitely distinctions between those two. In the American Republic, you've got this idea of slavery that is hereditary. It's something that continues on generation after generation. And so you've got these generations of individuals who have been enslaved, and you have people who, for whatever reason, some actually wanted to end slavery, others wanted to use this idea of colonization to have the enslaved people still remaining in the U.S. be worth more. But regardless, they did found the American Colonization Society because there were many people who felt that once enslaved African Americans were freed, that they could not live and coincide with white Americans. And so we've just got to find another place for them, whether that's the Caribbean or Africa, wherever. We just need that removal. And of course, these are people, this is their home too. They've been here for generations. Why would they want to move anywhere else? And especially once they are free. They also don't want to be separated from family, friends, community that they have built over the years. So the American Colonization Society kind of fizzles out at some point, and we get away from that idea, but it is still prevalent for many decades in American history.
Well, exactly. As far as I understand it, in the Roman perspective, all individuals were inherently born into a free condition, but the Romans did see slavery as a practice sort of needed in society, which was shared by every nation. So a bit like how I understand it went in the American South, this idea of unfortunate necessity.
Yes, and that's the thing, like for the longest, the idea was that, well, we didn't really want slavery, but it's here, and so we've just got to work with it. This idea that slavery would end at some point, and you see some of the leaders who profess, Jefferson, Madison, well, we don't really want to continue slavery, but we just don't see a way out. But then you go even further, once you get to the likes of John C. Calhoun, who actively promotes slavery as a necessary good. It isn't this necessary evil. It's a good thing in Calhoun's framework. And of course, you read this now and you just, it becomes so infuriating. And why did you think this? But it's really trying to entrench that idea of slavery in a way that you don't see in Rome. You don't see it nearly as this generational system and creating this part of society that you have established in this lesser condition, less rights, less freedom, because you've got the ruling class that's ruling over them for all time. It's this continual system that, from my understanding, in Rome, it wasn't quite as you were born a slave, you're going to be a slave for all of your life.
That's how I understand it as well. People could be freed and would be known as freedmen, which was still a different category of society, but at least you were free. Now, granted, from what I know, freedmen didn't have a lot of rights until the reign of the Emperor Justinian in about the 6th century, but there wasn't, like you say, this perpetual or indeed racial aspect. Romans would often take slaves from areas they conquered, but it wouldn't have this inherent bias against certain sectors of society.
And that's the thing, in the American context, there was even, this was the time of the Enlightenment. This was the time of science was evolving. And unfortunately, you have people who try to use science, the pseudoscience, to say that people of certain racial categories are inferior to people of other categories. And so that's why we can justify enslaving people, because they're inferior. They need us to protect them and to do all this. And it becomes this entire entrenched system that is also kept in place by legalities, to the point that even for folks who wanted to free enslaved people, the law said you can't. Or even if you could, you had to provide them with certain things, and they had to leave the state, which meant they had to leave their families, they had to leave their communities, they had to leave their homes. And so it's really trying to entrench this stratification and inequitable system in every way possible, intellectually, legally, societally. It's just trying to, and that is why we're still dealing with the ramifications of the American slaveocracy to the present day.
Both systems in their own way an unfortunate product of their time in terms of what influences came into the mix. I'm sure if the Romans had had this idea of social Darwinism, we wouldn't be talking about American versus Roman in quite the same balance with regards to this practice.
Yes, because that was one of the things with Rome. They knew how to establish an infrastructure. And so, like you said, Vince, I think that had they had this idea of social Darwinism and this pseudoscience, it could very well have been that they were the ones who started this more entrenched enslavement.
Yeah. There is one parallel when it comes to legalities of the state, which has just occurred to me. At least up until recently, is how I understand it, the US has had a very aspirational mindset when it comes to citizenship. So if you're born in the United States, you can become a citizen, you can work your way up. And in the same way, the Roman system was very much based around, even if you're not a Roman citizen, if you serve in the army, you can become a citizen, your children will be citizens. It strikes me there's this same aspirational quality. Absolutely.
And that was one of the things about citizenship. And, of course, we're still having those debates to the present day. What constitutes an American citizen? And likewise, I think in Rome, there was some debate, as the Roman Empire grew and more people came under the Roman banner, who becomes a citizen, who becomes a person who can participate in Rome, in the governance, in the societal structure. And likewise, in the US, it's been the same thing. And we've seen this expansion of the idea of what is a citizen, but it was very nebulous towards the beginning. What for a nation that just establishes itself, how do you define, who's a citizen and who's not? And it took time to really craft what that was. And you see debates about folks who are naturalized as American citizens. Albert Gallatin is one. He was a leader in the Democratic Republican Party. He became Secretary of the Treasury. He was prominent in the Jefferson and Madison administrations, but he was originally from what we now know of as Switzerland. And he was seen as still being a foreigner. He was attacked, even though he was technically a U.S. citizen. He wasn't seen by some folks, and especially his detractors, his foes, would attack him on, well, you're foreign born. You're not one of us. And I think you do have that some parallels and some parallel conversations in Rome as you do and you still do in the U.S.
Yeah. It definitely does become more of a debate as both countries get bigger, and even there, in a sense, both nations start off almost as the plucky underdogs, and slowly through, let's say, quote-unquote, defensive conflicts, we end up with both nations expanding to this point of aspiration in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I love that plucky underdog idea. That was definitely the U.S. in the early republic. It's just like, okay, you're doing an embargo act that you're not going to accept any trade at all. Yeah, have fun with that. That's foolish. You need our trade.
Well, even in how the US is made up in terms of its legal and governmental system, there's a lot of obvious parallels, such as the US Senate. Seems a very obvious comparison to make.
Exactly. And as they were crafting this idea of the U.S. Senate, they were trying to evoke this idea of the Roman Senate. And again, kind of one of those things, trying to establish a structure and an infrastructure that still harkens back to this Roman Republican ideal, this idea of the Senate is where the great debates are going to happen. This is where you're going to define what the Republic is and where the Republic is going. You're going to have these great orators, and you see that for so much of the U.S. Senate's history. The House of Representatives was seen as kind of the place for scraps and these back and forth. It was the less refined. But when you go to the Senate, that is the creme de la creme. These are the folks who really help to run the nation.
Yeah. That's where we'll find the Founding Fathers optimistically sat in togas.
Exactly. On one of those warm afternoons by the Potomac when it was like 90 degrees, they were sitting there in their togas.
So, I suppose to round out our discussion on a bit of a lighter note, we've spoken about the names of US cities and districts, but I have to confess, in our notes documents, you have told me about some names of individuals that I risked becoming very obsessed with because of how fantastic they are.
You definitely have some leaders in US history who you can tell at least, one, if not both of their parents were very much, and that's one thing, like with education in the U.S. in the early republic and for a good amount of time, it was based around this idea of the classics of antiquity. You wanted to learn your Latin and Greek. You wanted to be able to read the great orations. You wanted to read your Cicero and Cato. You wanted to read all of that. And so when it came to naming their children, you end up with names like Caesar Augustus Rodney and Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's a good name.
I would like to have been a fly on the wall when that naming process happened.
Exactly. Hold on. Let me find my book. Yep. Okay, here we go.
I have a few suggestions. Now, don't say no immediately. But even in the modern day, you have people like Muhammad Ali, who was born under the name Cassius Marcellus Clay, and that comes back to, for example, another one of Caesar's assassins. They really seem to be popular in this discussion, and the nephew of Augustus, Marcellus.
Exactly, and you get these names, and you have to do kind of let's go back and see what was the point of this, but this idea of wanting to be an assassin of Caesar, of tearing Caesar down. It's interesting, with some of these you wonder, was there a message to that? Or did they just think it sounded cool? Because I think of Totalis Rankium and them in their American President series and saying, anytime a Roman reference came up, folks high-fived, and you do kind of feel that way sometimes.
I have to confess that was strongly in the back of my mind when making the notes for this.
But it's interesting that it also speaks to, even if it's not an intentional message, just the fact that they're drawing on antiquity for these names and trying to establish this connection, because we know, and being a student of history can sometimes be frustrating when you end up with these family names. Like, I'm big into research on the Harrison family, and I saw that you had mentioned them as well in our notes. And you end up with these names that just go generation after generation after generation. And so you end up with generations of Benjamin Harrisons. And it's interesting. It's frustrating because it's like, which Benjamin Harrison are we talking about? But it also speaks to, like, this idea of trying to connect with antiquity, these names meaning something to families, becoming something that means something to families. And that's why you end up with names like Lucretia is popular for a long time. You've got Lucretia Clay, you've got Lucretia Garfield. It originally started with somebody thinking, oh, well, let me find this Roman name, but then it became a family name. It became something that was part of that family's legacy, that family's lore.
Yeah, it becomes something more in a way. I know the UK is definitely guilty, at least in the Middle Ages, of endlessly repeating the same name. I mean, Henry comes to mind for one. But I must confess, when I was looking at the Harrisons, I started treating it almost as a game of how far can I get this to go. And I discovered, although the direct Benjamin, son of Benjamin, ended with the 9th one, only the 9th, his nephew is sometimes regarded as the 10th, and in one, I can't remember where, an online page somewhere, it made an allusion to his widow having a child, Benjamin. So, we got to 11. I have no idea if that will carry on, but it's fantastic.
Well, and it's interesting because if you go into William Henry Harrison's family, you again see Benjamins. It's not that direct line of the first sons, but it's still Benjamin becomes a name. And of course, Benjamin Harrison, who was William Henry Harrison's grandson, became president. So even though it's not that direct link, that name still continues. And I know that that's, again, something that we see in the Roman example and in, through the Middle Ages and through time, you see the Henrys and the Eleanors that are prevalent.
Absolutely. And, well, they would have been proud that it's Roman in a sense, because I've tried looking at the various Roman leaders. Even Augustus would have been, if we translate it into US terms, Gaius Octavius V, and so on. But really, it's striking how many similarities there are, really, and many of them were intentional, but I'm sure many just happened due to historical circumstance.
Absolutely. And it ends up, and it's one of those things, once you start something, it can become something more. Instead of somebody thinking, oh, well, I'm naming this child Caesar Augustus because of Caesar Augustus, It's because of my uncle, Caesar Augustus, or my dad, Caesar Augustus. We're trying to keep that family name alive. It becomes, the past is present, and it becomes something personal versus just trying to grasp at this link with the ancient world.
Absolutely. Well, I think for both Roman and American, we can agree that history has not been kind to Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar.
No. And rightfully so for a number of reasons.
I think that about brings us to the end of our discussion. So, Jerry, thank you so much for coming on the show. And do you want to tell us a little bit about your podcast as well and where listeners can find you?
Absolutely. And thank you so much again for the invitation and for the wonderful conversation. So for folks who would like to explore more of the American side of things, my podcast is the Presidencies of the United States, and we go through presidential history from the very beginning. I am now 8 years into this. It's hard to believe that I've been doing this long, and I'm just now wrapping up the Madison presidency series with 250 plus episodes out there. But I do the deep dive so that you don't have to. But for folks who are interested, the website is presidenciespodcast.com. I'm available on all the major social media platforms and pretty much anywhere that you can find podcasts. Just search for Presidencies and you'll find me.
Well, Autocrat approves of the nice, relaxed pace with which you're going through things.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much again for coming on, and have a great week, everyone.